A new CBS News poll finds that the coronavirus outbreak is reshaping the presidential race in 3 key Sunbelt states. As a presumptive Democratic nominee, Biden is now leading President Trump by 6 points in Florida. And the two are tied in Arizona and in competitive Texas, where Biden is down by just a point to President Trump. The former vice president has made gains in part because most Floridians say that their state's efforts to contain the virus have been going badly. For more now, I want to bring in CBS News Elections and Surveys Director, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, great to see you, my friend. I'd like to start off with the broad view. Where does the race stand now, even in this early stage? And which states are toss-ups? Any surprises that you see here?
Hey, Lana, how are you? It's good to talk to you. And the broad look at all of this is really that Joe Biden is competitive in a lot of states where Republicans normally win. You mentioned one of them in Texas. You mentioned another, we just did the poll, in Arizona. That's another state that the president won last time out and that Republicans have won reliably. Part of that tells a story of the Sun Belt and maybe the expanding electoral map as we head into the fall election. But part of it is really seemingly linked to this spike in coronavirus cases and the way that it plays out politically. One of the things we find in the poll is that people in all of these states, in Arizona, in Texas, and in Florida, which you mentioned, feel that their states opened up too quickly, opened up the economy too fast. That's a majority feeling that. And then they told us that they felt the states did that because of pressure from the Trump administration. So, Lana, you combine that with feelings that the president isn't handling the outbreak well in those states, and he may be paying a price for it politically a little bit right now. So then you see that people who say that they're concerned about personally getting the coronavirus, well, the more concerned they are, the more they are saying they vote for Joe Biden. So there's that personal connection that's wrapped up into this, and again, possibly putting some of these Sunbelt states into play, Lana.
Does that mean that older voters, who we know are more likely often to go to the polls, or at least in this case, maybe cast their ballots, if not go to the polls, that they are now leaning more heavily towards Joe Biden rather than the president? Are you actually seeing movement among that critical voting bloc?
Well, we're seeing movement among seniors, and I want to be clear here. It doesn't mean that Joe Biden is winning them, the majority of them, because he's not, but most elections are really about margins, not so much necessarily who gets over or under 50 with any given group. Well, seniors are a group that has voted heavily Republican in these states, but in these polls we find Joe Biden cutting into some of Donald Trump's margins with seniors, and in particular, seniors who are very concerned about the coronavirus. Now, you mentioned another point, which is that who turns out to vote. That's something that we will talk about again and again from here to November. It's not just a question of it all comes down to turnout, as we pollsters and as pundits often say. This year, we know that because of the pandemic, there may be longer lines, there may be closed polling places. Certainly, we know that a lot of people would prefer to vote by mail, even though that's not always easy. That changes the dynamic. That makes this very much an election about access and about whether or not people can easily cast a ballot. We know from this poll that Joe Biden's voters say they would prefer to cast a vote by mail. So that's just one start of that dynamic that I think is going to be really important to watch as we head into September, October, when those mail ballots start, if they are available, becoming available on.
I imagine that has to make your job in trying to read these tea leaves, these polls, and these trend lines that much more difficult, because this isn't going to be a normal election. Are you learning anything more about what states are doing right now to try and make sure that everybody who wants to have their voice heard, that their votes are in fact counted?
It makes the job more interesting. I'll put it that way. You've really always got a challenge in determining who turns out. But of course, this year, look at what we've seen so far in the primaries. After the pandemic hit, we saw people standing in line for hours. We saw that shift over to mail ballots. And we also talk to people in the polls about whether or not they just find it easy or hard to vote. Some people find it very easy, others not so much. So it's a reminder as we go forward, and frankly, as you watch the polls, these are expressions of preference. But when we get down to it, the ability and the access for people, if they can actually cast that ballot, is going to be key.
All right, Anthony, I want to dig in just a little bit more on one potential battleground state, which is Texas. I think for many people, it is surprising that Texas could potentially be in play. But in your latest polling, you found that Biden is down just 1 point to Trump in the Lone Star State. So why, when we look at the CBS Battleground Tracker, is that state not listed as a potential toss-up, given that there's only 1 point difference, but is still listed as a likely or a leaning Trump?
That's a great question, and you want to emphasize the difference between any given poll and the overall race rating for a state. I think that state still leans red at this point because look at the history of Texas. It hasn't elected a Democrat for president since you'd have to go back to the disco era, right? 1976. So that history is strong there. And you also know that in order to win that state, if they were to, the Democrats would need a really high turnout from their core constituencies. That hasn't manifested itself yet. This is a poll. You don't want to take one poll at 1 point and use that against the whole weight of history. You want to see, I think, repeated evidence. There are some other polls that have Joe Biden close or even up in Texas. I think if we see that through the summer, we corroborate that, we see that then through the fall, then you certainly start to call Texas a toss-up, and that really means that it could go either way. There are plenty of other states that are toss-ups and that are leaning, and that again comes back to the point, it's July. Campaigns change, campaigns move. That's why they're campaigns. And so one should expect to see movement in all of these places as we go forward, Lana.
All right, Anthony Salvanto, you know I can never have enough time talking to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.